Good afternoon again, everybody. Today is my turn to share about being with Jesus study today. We are reading on Acts chapter 26. In fact, the saga started yesterday. This is when our sister Suyen shared about Paul being, in a sense, brought by Festus, and then he has to be brought in front of King Agrippa and Bernice. All right. So I'm going to title today's sharing Apologia. I'm not sure whether you heard of this word. It is a Greek word, Apologia, A-P-O-L-O-G-I-A. So that is a Greek word. So the Greek word apologia, it means verbal defense or a reasoned statement or argument. Now the King James Version of the Bible translate this word into the following manners. Defense 3 times. King James Version Bible translated the word apologia. Defense 3 times. Answer 3 times. Answer for oneself 1 time. Clearing for oneself 1 time. So in a sense, this word apologia, this Greek word, okay, King James Version essentially translated into different scenarios, but all of them pointed to defense. So in the English word, this is where the word apologetic, which we are very familiar with today, is derived from the word apologia. And it is simply from the Christian context as defense of the Christian faith. That's what apologetic is about. Excuse me. So in the olden time, in the biblical time, it is referred to a defense made by the defendant refuting the charges thrown against him by using apologia. Okay, defendant refuting the charges thrown against him by using a apologia. So in yesterday's in chapter 25 verse 16, the word is used, okay, when Paul said it is not the manner of the Romans to deliver any man to die before that he which is accused have the access, okay, have the access face to face and have license to answer for himself. Okay, so this answer for himself is basically the word apologia concerning the crime laid against him. So in today's reading, Acts chapter 26, what we are seeing here, it is not merely Paul trying to get himself off the hook, but rather we can see apologetic in action by Paul. Now we can study and dissect and learn how Paul not only defended his faith, but he took the opportunity to preach the gospel to the masses. Okay, to the masses. It is essentially an open air evangelistic meeting to both the Gentile and the Jews. Okay, so I hope everybody can visualize what is happening since yesterday. He is brought to an auditorium and he had to defend. So it's essentially an open air evangelistic meeting. First, let us again look at the background of today's reading. From yesterday's readings, chapter 25, we read how Festus, he needed to write a charge. Okay, he needed to write a charge sheet against Paul before he could transfer Paul to Rome. Festus, we read, he knew Paul was not guilty, but he was hoping that probably an informal hearing by King Agrippa or Herod II can clarify the matter so he can complete writing his report for Emperor Nero. Okay, so this is what happened in chapter 25. Now the emperor has given King Agrippa the right to appoint high priest and as custodian of the Jewish temple's treasury. So in a sense, King Agrippa, he was, okay, he's from the, what we call the Idumean Jewish family, and he is knowledgeable, okay? He is knowledgeable of Jewish affairs. So we need to know, in fact, King Agrippa is just not a normal person. So Rome, or King Nero, viewed King Agrippa as an authority on Jewish religious matters. How do we know that? Because in today's reading, verse 3, this is what Paul said. Hence the reason why Festus sought King Agrippa's help in writing out his report or the charge sheet against Paul. Now we know the background. Now let's look at the settings of today's reading. The setting is, we read from yesterday's verse 23. King Agrippa and Bernice, they came with great pomp, with many high-ranking military officers and prominent men and women of the city. So these were essentially the most important, in a sense, leaders of Caesarea and Judea. They followed King Agrippa. So now it is no longer just an informal hearing as what Festus had wished for. It is now, okay, a great social gathering in a sense. Some may look at it as being an entertainment event, but at the same time, all these leaders, when they gathered, they were curious to know, what is the fuss about? What is the fuss about? The havoc being created by this non-conspicuous man. Okay, why do we say Paul is a non-conspicuous man? Because we read and we can find out from a lot of Jewish history writers, he is not, very well built. Maybe he's not handsome, but he's very short or he's stout. That's why he is a non-conspicuous person, and yet he has created so much trouble and havoc, okay, in the region for the last few years. So looking at the settings again, so we know that to an ordinary person like you and me, this will be an intimidation because you will be looking at the glare of the mass audience. But to Paul, when we come to chapter 26 today, it is the perfect settings. It is the perfect settings created by God. So now let us now go into detail today's reading. Earlier I said we can learn from Paul how he carried out or how he conducted the apologetics sessions in front of non-believers. The first thing, if you notice in verse 2, he shared joyfully. Okay, he shared joyfully instead of sharing it in a very threatening tone. Why do I say that? Because sometimes when we tend to defend our faith, our tone can be very threatening to the non-believers. So in verse 2, Okay, depending on the Bible that you are using. Okay, verse 2, Paul said, I am fortunate. Okay, NIV and NLT both use the word fortunate. But King James Version Bible say, I am happy. I am happy. That's what he told King Agrippa. Now, how many of us in Paul's situation can still consider ourselves happy or fortunate in that big auditorium, in front of all the prominent leaders and all the military officers? That is because Paul, okay, that is because Paul, he knew this is an opportunity in disguise to share the gospel to all the prominent people, the kings, the rulers, the officials included. And he knew this is the fulfillment of what Jesus has told him. Earlier, a few weeks ago, we read in Acts chapter 9, verse 15, when Jesus spoke to Paul, that Paul will be Jesus' chosen instrument to proclaim his name to the Gentiles and their kings and to the people of Israel. So I believe in many occasions, this work starts in Paul's mind every time when he is in front of mass audience, in front of the VIPs, because he is Jesus' chosen instrument. Now, another reason Paul said he's happy or fortunate because, as I said earlier, King Agrippa, he's an expert in Jewish religious and custom matters. And he believed in Old Testament prophets. Verse 27 today, that's what Paul said. Do you believe in Old Testament prophets? Which he does. So Paul, in a sense, say he's happy and fortunate because he should get an impartial hearing and a passionate hearing session. So in any circumstances, okay, when we share, like Paul did, with a grateful heart, God will be with us as we read further, today in chapter 26. So the first lesson we can learn when he is being apologetic is he shared with a grateful and joyful heart. Then the next things that we can learn from Paul is about confession. Confession. No apologetic can be effective without confessing one's weakness or even the sinful past before one's salvation. Okay, Paul started by saying, I live a Pharisee life. I live a Pharisee life, faithful and zealous in defending God. That's from verse 4 to verse 11. Basically, he opened up himself to be scrutinized. It is not a boastful remarks by Paul. His whole intention was to tell the audience about his privileged and his prestige background and his deep conviction of God's promise made to the Jewish ancestors. What is the promise God made to the Jewish ancestors? The promise of the Messiah. So Paul, in a sense, shared about his past, that he did come with a very logical, very so-called qualified thinking, and he truly hold on to what his upbringing, his teaching about the promises of God. And most importantly, what is the promise of God? That God can raise the dead. In verse 8, God can raise the dead. Now, Festus, as we read earlier in chapter 25, must have told Agrippa earlier in verse 19 of chapter 25, Acts chapter 25, about who Jesus was and what Paul had claimed, that Jesus was dead but alive again. So, again, Paul has shared earlier about from his belief and his deep conviction. Paul didn't ridicule or put down other people just because of what he has believed in Jesus. But he further, in a sense, leverage on the common ground that he had with the others, which is belief in the promises made by God. And he expounded on it. He expounded on it, his new encounter, his new faith, and the revelation that he has received from Jesus. So what we can learn again from Paul about being apologetic, we can learn that Paul, during his defense of his faith, he never ridiculed others, meaning put down others' belief, who could have shared the same practice or belief with him in the past, essentially the Pharisees. So by asking them in verse 8, why does it seem incredible to any of you that God can raise the dead? He is now on a subtle offensive mode, meaning he's asking the Pharisee now, why does it seem impossible? Or why does it seem incredible that God can raise the dead? Again, what we can see here is Paul shared on common ground to further drive in his main point, that there won't be any Christian faith without a resurrection. That is the key of the Christian faith. There's no Christian faith without resurrections. So what we learn from Paul here is when he is defending his faith, he shared on the common ground with his listeners, those who believe the same like him, but yet he further expounded on it. He's further expounded on it about the promises of God through the Jewish ancestors. The fourth one that we can learn is he shared his personal encounter and his personal testimony. Where do we find that? It is in verse 12 to verse 21. By this time, this is the third time Paul shared about his conversion. The first was in Acts chapter 9, verse 3 to 19. The second occasion is in Acts chapter 22, verse 6 onwards. Now, each of these three, meaning he's sharing about his encounter with Jesus, each has its emphasis and fit the audience at that point of time. So his encounter with Jesus, okay, has transformed Paul from a persecutor of Christians to become a proclaimer of gospel to the Gentiles. Verse 17 to 18. Essentially, he obeyed Jesus' command. Now he is the proclaimer of gospel to the Gentile. His effort in preaching, about repentance from sin, to the Gentile, we know it did bear fruit. How do we know that? Because we can see at all the churches that has been planted by him during his various mission trips. In a way, Paul was telling the audience not only he had met Jesus the Messiah, through him, many have been saved by turning back to God. It is about God is at work and he just obeyed the command. That is his personal testimony to share about his encounter with Jesus and being obedient to Jesus. Another one we can learn about Paul in apologetic is the most crucial part, to wrap it up by challenging people on their salvations, which is in verse 22 to 27, the challenge to receive salvation. Now, when Festus interrupted and told Paul that he's insane, he's mad, Paul, instead of rebuking or answer back angrily, he deflected it by redirecting the questions to Agrippa. He deflected by redirecting the question to Agrippa. Jesus' resurrections was still fresh in many people's mind that point in time, and some of the witnesses were still alive. Some of the witnesses were still alive when Paul was there. Acts chapter 26, verse 26, Paul said, I am convinced that none of this has escaped his notice because it was not done in a corner. Meaning it is not hidden. It was not done in a corner. Everybody would have heard the resurrections of Jesus. Everybody would have known somebody who was a witness at that point of time. So after laying out all the facts and all the evidence, a personal decision needs to be made without hesitation. And that is why Paul seized the opportunity and threw a challenge, not just to King Agrippa, but to everyone there and then. Now, if Agrippa, if he was a worshiping Jew, he would have believed what the prophets had said, and accept Jesus as the promised Messiah. But we know that he refused. He refused not because he didn't believe, because he didn't want to be caught in a logical trap. He didn't want to be caught in a logical trap, which is in verse 28, in such a short time, you can persuade me to be a Christian. So in a sense, it is telling us sometimes when people refused to accept the truth, even with all the facts and the evidence, they didn't want to take one more step, like what King Agrippa was doing. He didn't want to be caught in a logical trap. But when Paul faced rejections in a way, he didn't give up. And this is what we can learn. He continued to pray for those who didn't believe him. Verse 29, that's what he said, including all of them who were present at that point in time. So what we can learn from Paul is a reminder to us when others don't want to receive the good news without having to go through persecutions, okay, we still continue to pray for them. But then, of course, sometimes God had his plan. Some need to go through persecutions or hardship before they open up their hearts and believe in Jesus. So in a quick manner, I just basically shared about apologetics, how we can learn from Paul. Be joyful, be grateful to God. Share about his own personal testimony. Share about his obedience. And he finished off, even though he asked people, essentially invite them to the altar call, though they rejected, he still said that I will continue to pray for you. Now, before I wrap up today, there's an interesting verse. I'm not sure, again, you notice that it's in verse 14. When Paul shared about his encounter with Jesus, some version of the Bible, okay, some version of the Bible said, let me just read from NIV. Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me? It is hard for you to kick against the goats. G-O-A-D-S, goats. Now I need to do some background search of what is this goats. Apparently it was mentioned once in the book of Judges. And it is basically a goat is an sharpened stick, okay, to guide the cow or the oxen to move forward or to direct during plowing. So sometimes the ox or the cow will refuse to listen and they will kick back. But the minute they kick back, they will kick the goats and they will feel the pain and they have to obey. So the more that they kick, the more the pain for the ox or the cow. So when Jesus was telling Paul, okay, why do you kick against the goats? It reminded me that it applies to both ourselves as a Christian and non-Christians, that there is no point fighting against God's will and God's plan. When God directed us, there's no point, because the more we want to fight back, the more pain it is. Okay, so though one may not be persecuting others, okay, like what Paul or Saul was doing, but we should not struggle against our own conscience and instead listen to the direction of God intended for us. Just like how an ox will just plow forward. So even as I read today's reading, yes, Paul was carrying out his apologetic sessions, but hidden inside, again, it is reminding us, sometimes are we kicking against the goats by not following the path or the direction that God has set for us. So it is a question or reflection for all of us, to ponder on. And I hope through today's sharing, as I say, that we can learn or pick up, ways that Paul was doing in front of this mass audience of the prominent leaders of Caesarea and Judea, without being intimidated, but yet he still continued to pray for the people. As he said, even when he was in chain,